All right, here we go. Another village profile. Today we will be tackling the village of Ambler. And I don't know if I can call it a village, but we'll say the island of Amchitka. Both of these places are interesting in their own right, for different reasons though. And today we start with the village of Ambler. I have been to Ambler, but I think only once, maybe twice. Probably twice to pick someone up and drop that same person off. And I remember flying in there because it was very low, cloudy weather, and it's surrounded by mountains, which is when you're scud running and have low visibility, it's still VFR. But when there's very few landmarks, I remember feeling uncomfortable. And when I got to the village, kind of had to dodge around some floating clouds in the area, and I came in, I landed on 01, and I remember it was just a little bit uncomfortable, but I went fine. So I've been to Ambler. Ambler is located 138 miles northeast of Kotzebue, and it's near the confluence of the Ambler and Kobuk rivers. Ambler is one of the few villages north of the Arctic Circle that I've been to. There are a few others. The Arctic Circle is defined as the latitude at which the sun does not set on summer solstice and it doesn't rise on winter solstice. So in the summer, north of this line, the sun simply does not set on those warm summer nights. And in the winter, the sun does not rise, so you're in total darkness. This line shifts about 14 meters per year due to the Earth's axial tilt. I did not know that line moved, but apparently it moves 14 meters every year. This line is just over 66 degrees north latitude of the equator, and Ambler sits at just over 67 degrees north, so just barely over that line, giving them some days without sunsets and days without sunrises every year. The village was named after an explorer named James M. Ambler, who died on an Arctic expedition in the 1800s, and this became the name of the village. After serving in the Civil War in his youth, Ambler studied medicine at the University of Maryland and graduated in 1870. He ended up on the Arctic exploration crew of the Jeannette in 1879. They sailed from San Francisco, California, to the ice pack north of Siberia, and they found themselves trapped in the pack ice. James Ambler did the best he could by treating various health issues, including frostbite, but the ship sank in June of 1881. The crew did the best they could to survive on the ice pack, but in the end, everyone died of starvation or exposure by the end of October of 1881. Ambler was said to be one of the last 3 survivors before they succumbed to the elements. The bodies of the crew were found later, along with their journals, which is how we know what happened. The village of Ambler, named after the explorer, was permanently settled in 1958 when people from Shugnak and Kobuk moved downstream because of the variety of fish, wild game, and spruce trees in the area. The post office was established in 1963. So this was pretty interesting, and you could go back to learn more about this. I have an episode called Who Was Maniilaq? Maniilaq is known as the Eskimo Prophet, and he mentions Ambler in his prophecies. Maniilaq lived from early 1800s to late 1800s, and he predicted that Ambler would become a huge city because of something precious found there. Some people say that the rich copper veins found nearby, and the establishment of this village fulfills this prophecy, because part of the prophecy is this would become a very large city because of what was found there. Other people say this does not fulfill the prophecy because it's not a very large city. The current population is 274 as of the 2020 census, So this is about a mid-size Alaskan village, so you can be the judge whether that fulfills Maniilaq's prophecy or not. And some say yes, and some say no. Ambler is about 85% native, 13% white. So it's still basically a native dominated village. The Ambler School, as of 2017, had 7 teachers and 69 students. Their sports team are called the Ambler Grizzlies, and their school motto is "Through our way of life together as one." The coldest temperature recorded in Ambler was negative 74 degrees, and the hottest temperature was 93 degrees. So I took it upon myself to do the math. That's a 167-degree temperature range, which is actually very incredible. A place that can get up to 93 degrees. You know, I used to live in Tucson, Arizona, and that was probably the hottest place I've ever lived. It would get hotter than 93 there, but even 93 is incredibly hot, especially for a place above the Arctic Circle. And of course, the negative 74 is perhaps expected given its location, but a 167-degree temperature range, that's amazing. In 1959, a Friends Church was established in Ambler, and it was pastored by Arthur and Minnie Gray. Some records show that the tithes were something between 10 cents and $4. But the church developed a relatively large cache of reindeer meat, whale meat, ptarmigan, and fish. That's such an Alaskan way to tithe is with meat from hunts. Today, there are 2 recorded churches in Ambler, First Baptist Church of Ambler and Ambler Friends Church. I wasn't able to find much more information about these churches, just from internet searches. So it'd be interesting to learn more about that. In 1962, a linguist from the Summer Institute of Linguistics out of Fairbanks, Alaska, sent a translator named Zibels, and he came to Ambler. It was his aim to translate the scriptures into the Eskimo language. The local church welcomed him and helped them with that effort. Ultimately, the scriptures were translated, and noted efforts were made by the Friends Church to preserve Eskimo culture that would have otherwise been lost. And so, in this case, you know, it's a kind of a stereotype that the church in Alaska robbed the native people of their culture. There is some truth to that, but it's not that simple. You should go back and listen to my History of the Church in Alaska series for more on that. But here is a case where the church made conscious efforts to preserve the Eskimo culture, and this has been noted. And I found this really interesting. I kind of nerd out on ancient history stuff. There is a very interesting archaeological site near Ambler in a place called Onion Portage. This site and a few others formed the basis of the modern understanding of human history in Arctic Alaska. This site was discovered by Arctic archaeologist J. Lewis Giddings in 1940. He found some house pits, but it was not until 1961 when he discovered that this site had a highly stratified nature. Giddings had built a cabin for his 1964 excavation, which has been preserved by the National Park Service, which is still there today. Giddings described his experience in the north was more dramatic than opening King Tut's tomb. So obviously he was very fascinated by what he was finding. He primarily relied on dendrochronology to date his findings. Dendrochronology is matching tree rings to known dates and interpolating ring data to find when wooden tools that he found in the ground were made. Local villages told Giddings that this site was a strategic location for hunters to wait for caribou to cross the river and shoot them as they were making their way across. This is called intercept hunting, that apparently has been used as a strategy for a long time, which is likely why he found so much archaeological things right here at this site. The Ambler Airport is Papa Alpha Foxtrot Mike. Its elevation is 293 feet, and there are two crossing runways. There's 0119 and 1028. And if I remember right, when I landed there, I landed on 01, and I believe it's like an uphill grade if you land on 01. Having the uphill and downhill element can be nice if the winds are in your favor. But yeah, taking off downhill feels quite nice, having the runway disappear from under you as you take off, and then landing the uphill slows you down quite nicely. There is an approach plate, RNAV GPS for runway 01. So a nice landing procedure there. The main runway 0119 is 4,000 feet long, and the shorter runway 1028 is 2,400 feet. So these runways are plenty long for almost any airplane to land. And I remember landing there and thinking I had so much runway in front of me. So well maintained and a good place for larger planes to get into. There's no roads or anything that go into Ambler. It's a completely off-road system. So this runway is heavily relied upon for the people there. All right, that's all for Ambler. Let's talk about Amchitka. Amchitka is unique because it's not really a village. It's more like just an empty island. Located on the Rat Islands of the Aleutian chain, this island is way, way out there near the end of the chain. Just looking at this place on Google Earth, there's a real sense that it is a totally abandoned place today. Just looks like a treeless plateau and low vegetation throughout. This volcanic island is known as one of the least stable tectonic environments in the United States. The island is 42 miles long and about 3 miles wide and has a population of 0. In 1980, human remains of at least one person was found on Amchitka by an employee of the National Wildlife Refuge. However, no radiocarbon dates or other attempts of dating these remains were done, but the remains are said to be consistent with pre-contact Aleut populations. So there's very little evidence of people there, just the one body found. It is estimated that there were about 25,000 Aleuts across the entire archipelago. Russian contact, however, brought in foreign disease, harsh treatment, and a major disruption of the society. It's estimated that the people shriveled to about 10% of its original numbers. In the 1910 census, they only recorded 1,491 Aleuts on the entire island chain. So disease totally wiped out these people. It's kind of the story of Native America, is disease killed more than any other reason. Amchitka is reported to have been named Saint Macarius by Vitus Bering in 1741. Now, Bering is why we call it the Bering Sea. He's recognized as the first person to discover Alaska, although there were a few people sooner than him. It was also cited later by Joseph Billings in 1790, and it was visited by Shishmarev, another Russian explorer, in 1820. There's a very interesting, harrowing story from 1783 where a ship set sail from Japan, got caught in a storm, and drifted for 7 months before washing up on Amchitka. Only one sailor died during the drift, and 15 Japanese were castaways on Amchitka Island. The Russians and local Aleuts cared for the castaways and even put them to work. During their stay, they witnessed the 1784 Aleut Uprising against the Russian fur traders. Furs were becoming more scarce, and the Russians were not delivering as much supply for the furs supplied by the Aleut people. In the conflict, the Russians killed 4 Aleut leaders, which led to the Aleuts leaving for the island of Atka. By 1812, the survivors returned to Amchitka, but were removed again by the Russians in 1832. Since then, it appears that the island was never reoccupied again. However, it was used as hunting grounds. In 1920, the native residents of Atka leased Amchitka for fox farming. This lasted until the Japanese invaded Alaska in 1942. I would really like to know what fox farming is. I don't know what that is, but that's what they used it for. The Japanese in World War II had taken Attu and Kiska, taking native prisoners of war, and were held under very harsh conditions. Fearing a Japanese attack, the U.S. government evacuated hundreds of Aleut people from nearby islands, including Amchitka, and sent them to internment camps in southeastern Alaska. These small, tight-knit internment camps made disease spread quickly, and many in these camps were killed. Efforts were made to compensate the survivors by the U.S. government, and they offered a formal apology for the treatment of those people. Amchitka was recognized as a key location for the conflict with the Japanese. It was determined to be very difficult to build an airfield on the island. However, planners said that an airfield just had to be built, or the Japanese would do the same. An airfield was finally constructed in February of 1943, put in the U.S. only 50 miles from the Japanese-held Kiska Island. 3 airstrips, numerous buildings, and roads popped up, and at its peak, there were 15,000 troops on Amchitka Island. When the Aleutian Island campaign ended in August of 1943, the population quickly declined, and eventually the entire post was abandoned at the end of 1950. And once again, it was an empty island. But shortly after this, plans began for nuclear testing to take place on Amchitka Island. They wanted to determine the difference in seismic readings between an underground nuclear detonation and a natural earthquake for better monitoring the Russian activities. The Great Earthquake of 1964 in Alaska, I think it's called the Good Friday earthquake, made this a controversial thing, with fears of causing more natural earthquakes because of the nuclear detonation. Nonetheless, on October 29, 1965, an underground nuclear bomb called Longshot was detonated, yielding a blast of 80 kilotons, which, relatively speaking, is not that big for a nuclear explosion. 2 more tests were conducted called Milrow and Canakin. Milrow was detonated on October 2nd, 1969, with just a yield of 1 megaton. It was reported that the surrounding sea turned to froth and geysers of mud and water blasted into the air. Controversy over environmental concerns began a few days after the Milrow detonation. Milrow being the precursor to the much larger Canakin test, there was worry that the detonations would cause earthquakes and tsunamis. It is said that as the activist was leaving the meeting over the controversy, one man gave the traditional farewell of the peace activist movement, simply saying, "Peace," as he was leaving. To which another member replied, "Make it a Greenpeace." And so the committee became known as Greenpeace. I never knew that about Greenpeace. There you go. Amchitka Island is why Greenpeace is called Greenpeace. Ultimately, the U.S. government determined that the risk of causing earthquakes and tsunamis was very minimal, and they moved forward with the final test. A committee called Don't Make a Wave Committee even chartered a boat to sail to the island and protest, but they were ultimately stopped. The test, called Canakin, was detonated on November 6, 1971. They dug a hole 6,104 feet underground inside a 54-inch steel casing, and they detonated it there. The yield was announced to be 5 megatons, which is 400 times larger than the Hiroshima bomb, and this was the largest underground nuclear test in U.S. history. The ground lifted 20 feet and then sank into a depression, created a new lake called Cannikin Lake. You can still see it on Google Earth today. The Richter scale read 7.0, but the feared chain of reaction earthquakes never took place. You can actually watch these tests. I watched them on YouTube. If you looked up Project Cannikin 1971, you can watch these tests. It's pretty cool. The Department of Energy continues to monitor the site today to make sure radioactive material remains contained underground, which apparently it does seem like it is being contained. In 2025, the island is expected to become a restricted access wildlife preserve. Kind of makes me wonder, like, what animals are still there even after this test. I imagine they're fine if the radioactivity is contained. So there might be some good hunting there. And 2025 is just around the corner. That's interesting. Today, there are no registered airports on Amchitka Island, but on Google Earth, you can still see the remains of the military installments. I do not know what the future of this place will be, but as I record this, it is the day before this huge election between Trump and Harris, and both sides of the political aisle are concerned about World War III. It's kind of like when you turn on the news, it's kind of like the whisper behind every foreign policy conversation is World War III. If the worst were to happen again, I fully suspect that Amchitka Island will be utilized again. So from a single ancient Aleut person's body found in 1980 to 15,000 troops being stationed there in World War II to 3 underground nuclear tests being conducted, this barren, remote island has played a larger role in the human history than you might think. And who knows what the future of this place might be, even thinking about the way the world is going. All right, so that's all for this episode of Village Profiles on Tell Your Story Alaska. Next week, we will be talking about oh wow, this is a hard one to pronounce, Inuktitut Pass and Anchor Point. I apologize for mispronouncing it. I did not look up how to pronounce this one before I got to this. But hang in there. We will talk about those 2 villages next week. We will see you then.